Good evening, comrades, and welcome to another edition of Why Marx. Tina Volkmann's having a well-earned break, and we have with us this evening Moshe Machover and Mike Macnair talking about the nature of democracy in a newly formed socialist society. Marx and Engels famously didn't draw up any widespread blueprints for what a socialist society would look like, but the question of democracy in a future socialist society is absolutely vital, not least of which because now we've had to contend with the whole history, for example, of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China and so on. And we have to differentiate what kind of democratic society it would be and how it is different qualitatively and possibly quantitatively from democracy under capitalism. And so both Moshe and Mike Macnair will talk for about 30 minutes on the question of democracy in a socialist society, and then it's open to the floor for discussions and contribution. So, without further ado, then, our distinguished guest, Moshe Machover, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, comrade. First, full disclosure. I'm going to talk about why council communism is wrong. And the disclosure is that I used to subscribe to something very much like council communism. If I can share my screen, can I? Can I share the screen?
You should be able to do it now, Moshe.
What?
You should be able to share now, Moshe.
So why can't? Can you see my screen?
We can't. If you want to send the file by email, I could have a go at sharing the screen, or you could carry on.
Oh, okay. Well, never mind. I'll let this go. Can you see my screen now?
We can see lots of your screen if you want to maximize the thing you're trying to share.
Can you see the Matzpen screen?
Yes.
Yes. Well, these are the basic principles of Matzpen, which were drafted first in 1973 and then amended. But if you scroll to, this is a sort of rudimentary program, or if you like, a sketch of a program. It consists of, if I remember correctly, 14 items, 14 paragraphs, 14 clauses. 8 and 9, if you look at them, which I don't want to go into detail, it will take too much time, are...
Moshe, sorry, someone in the chat saying they can't read. Could you maximize the browser window and then zoom in a little bit? Oh, okay, that's great. Thanks.
Okay. I don't want to concentrate on this too long. I'm just you can scroll online. You can find it online under the Matzpen website, which is alive, and look for basic principles. Items 8 and 9 are clearly imbued with the ideology of council communism. Later on, so this dates from the 1970s. Okay, can we stop the share? Stop share. Right. Okay. Later on in later decades, I became, for some reason that is quite independent of my initial political views, in the in research and writing on the mathematical theory of voting, especially of voting power. And the more I got into it and published some stuff on it, including some, fundamental basic monograph on the subject, it became clear to me that as a vehicle of decision making, the council structure is inappropriate. It simply doesn't work. Nevertheless, it is supported and proposed by people on the libertarian end of socialism or communism. I think quite irrespective of the value of councils as a means of mobilizing and concentrating a revolutionary struggle as a framework for decision making, they are simply wrong. And I'm going to explain why this is the case. Let me first of all read. I don't want to complicate matters by trying to share the screen again. So I'm going to read a typical text written by a council communist or by libertarian, and I'm referring here to Stephen Shalom, who is also cited by another libertarian socialist, quasi-anarchist, Michael Albert. This is how he describes the structure of councils as a framework for decision making. Okay, quote, there would be primary level councils that would include every adult in the society. The number of members in these primary level councils would be somewhere between 25 to 50. Each primary level council would choose a delegate to a second level council. Each second level council would be composed of 20 to 50 delegates. Probably the same size as the primary council, but not necessarily so. Likewise, each second level council would choose delegates to third level councils, and so on until there was one single top level council for the entire society. The number of members on each council would be determined on the basis of the society-wide decision and perhaps revised on the basis of experience, etc. The size of the council should be small enough to guarantee that people can be involved in deliberative bodies where all can participate in face-to-face discussions, but yet big enough so that, one, there is adequate diversity of opinion included, and two, the number of layers of councils needed to accommodate the entire society is minimized. For example, if all councils have 25 members, they're assuming half the population consists of adults, then 5 layers would accommodate a society of 19 million. 5 layers, that is to say, bottom level of councils, then a second level of council consisting of delegates from the top bottom level, then a third level consisting of delegates from the second level, etc., etc. I'm interpolating these explanations. With councils up to 40 members, 5 layers would accommodate 200 million people, and 50-person councils could accommodate 625 million people in the 5th level, etc., etc. What is clear from this description, irrespective of the precise numbers given, is that we have here a pyramidal structure consisting of several levels. Shalom says 5 levels needed for a society of several million voters. Let's take a more optimistic number. Let us say each bottom level council would be 100 people, 100 members, and each one sending a delegate to a top level, to a second level council consisting of therefore of 100 delegates. That would accommodate a society of 10,000 voters. That's 100 times 100. In order to accommodate a million voters, you would need 3 levels, etc., etc. For a country, a society of several millions, you would need 4 or 5 levels. I'm assuming a council size of 100 members because a larger council would be impractical for conducting meaningful discussions face to face. Now, the most salient and obvious aspect or property of this kind of decision-making mechanism is that it is extremely indirect. Contrary to the idea of libertarian communism that recommends direct decision-making, actually a pyramid of councils results in very indirect decision-making. This has been criticized, and in the essay that I've circulated, I've quoted detailed criticism, mainly by excuse me one moment, let me find Glazer, a South African socialist, has published a very interesting article a long time ago in which he criticizes the idea of pyramidal council-type decision-making in qualitative terms. That is to say, for example, it requires members of society at the ground level, at the bottom level, to be almost full-time engaged in discussion and decision-making. Please note that in a socialist society, the number of, let us say, decisions on the national level would have to be much greater than the number of, let us say, decisions that a bourgeois parliament makes, because not only what is regarded today as political decisions have to be made, but also the economy would need to be fed by constant decision-making. That would mean that it would require the majority of the population to be incessantly engaged in discussion and decision-making. This is simply asking too much from people who have other things to do in life. You know, if you have to incessantly attend meetings in order to discuss every detail of political decision, I mean, this will result actually in people, you know, turning off the whole idea, because people have other things in life to engage in. There are other similar critiques to be made of the unrealistic demands that this pyramidal decision-making framework would require from the general members of society. But I want to concentrate on a quantitative aspect of the structure, the pyramidal structure of decision-making, which is less well known and requires a little bit of mathematical analysis. I'm going to try to make the mathematics as simple and as transparent as possible. My critique of the Council mechanism for decision-making concentrates on two related aspects. First of all, the attenuation of the power of voters, the influence that voters have on the final decision. Secondly, on the increase, the more levels, the more tiers the pyramid has, the more likely is a situation where the decision taken at the top level will be against the majority opinion at the bottom. That is to say, a situation like happened in recent elections in the American presidential elections, where the candidate that got the majority in the electoral college had a minority of votes at the country level, at the countrywide level, at the federal level. This is not a peculiarity of the American system. It is, in fact, a property of any decision-making that is multi-level. It is always possible that the decision taken at the top level will go against the majority view of society at large. The more levels there are in the pyramid, and the bigger the society, the more levels you need. If you have to have meaningful discussions at the bottom level councils, the more likely is this undesirable phenomenon of the decision going against the society level majority. But this is also connected for mathematical reasons with the attenuation of voting power. Now, let me explain briefly what voting power is. The power of a voter under a given decision-making system, and I'm talking about decision-making simply that makes decisions yes or no, or red and blue, let us say, a binary decision, in other words. The voting power of a given voter is the a priori probability of that voter being decisive, having the decisive vote in a given exercise of the voting. Let me give us a very simple example. Suppose I'm a member of an 11 member committee that makes decisions yes or no. Okay, And suppose the decision rule of that committee is unanimity. Decisions are passed if the whole committee votes unanimously for it. This is an extreme case of a voting rule. But let us see what is the voting power, or what is my voting power or a priori voting power in this committee. My vote will matter only if all the other members of the committee are for the given motion. Suppose a motion is proposed. My vote will matter only if all of them are in support. If at least one of them is against, then it doesn't matter how I vote, because the resolution will not pass anyway. Since it requires unanimity, my vote will matter only if all the other voters are in favor of it. And then I will exercise my veto, if you like, because of the rule of unanimity. Now, the a priori probability of all the 10 members other than me being for the motion is 2024 to 1. That is to say, about 1 in 1,000. That is the probability of my vote making any difference. Now compare this to the same committee operating under a simple majority rule, okay? In this case, my vote will matter, will make a difference only in case the other 10 are divided 5 for and 5 against, because then I will make the decisive vote. If the other members, the other 10 members are divided in any other way other than 5 and against 5, then it doesn't matter how I vote, it won't make any difference. Now, the probability, a priori probability of 10 people being divided 5 against 5 can be calculated very easily. There is a mathematical formula for it. And it turns out that the probability of such a division is about 1 in 4. So you see the huge difference in voting power. The unanimity rule will give me a power of 1 in 1,000, which is an extremely small probability, of course, compared to 1 in 4, one in 4, which is a quite substantial probability. Now, if you analyze the voting power of a voter in a multi-tier system, it turns out that as the number of tiers increases, the voting power of a given voter decreases, is attenuated. Let me take, for example, a two-tier system consisting of 100 councils at the bottom level, each consisting of 100 members. At the second level, there is a single council of 100 delegates from the 100 councils. So altogether, we have 10,000 members of this toy society, if you like. Now, it can be proved, and I don't want, of course, to go into the technical details, that if you compare, these 10,000 people could have a general meeting, if you like, a referendum of direct referendum of 10,000 members of this toy society. In this, and let us say that the rule is the optimal rule for decision making, which is simple majority rule. I've already indicated that compared to all other possible rules of decision, the simple majority is the one that empowers voters most. This is, by the way, another mathematical argument for the simple majority rule. Of course, in some cases, for other reasons, you may want to have other decision rules. For example, on fundamental programmatic, let us say, rules of procedure, you may want to prevent too easy change. So you may want a super majority. But for normal decision making, in order to optimize the voting power of each voter, the simple majority rule is really the one to look at. Okay, so compare the voting power of a grassroots voter in a structure consisting of 100 councils, each of 100 members. Compare it to what would occur if the 10,000 members of the whole society had a referendum. It turns out that the voting power in the two-tier system is about 80% of the voting power in a direct referendum. That is to say, in this two-tier level, the voting power of each voter is attenuated to the extent of something less than 80%, 0.79 or something. Now, this happens in a two-tier system. If you add another tier, the attenuation of voting power becomes worse exponentially. That is to say, in a three-tier system, the voting power of each voter at the grassroots level will be about 0.64 of the power that they would have in a direct referendum. And this actually works exponentially. The more tiers you have in a system, the lesser the voting power of each member of the society becomes. These two phenomena, that is to say, the attenuation, the decrease of voting power with the increase of the number of levels, and the absurd phenomenon of the decision at the top level going against the majority at the grassroots level, these two are actually mathematically connected. Although they seem two separate, let us say, diseases of the pyramidal council system, they are mathematically connected. This is a theorem that I proved, that it is published in articles and in books I've written. So anyway, but the fact is that both phenomena are highly undesirable. This leads to the conclusion that the proper desirable mechanism for decision making in a transitional society, and in fact in the communist society, if a mechanism for decision making is required, is a single directly elected assembly, parliamentary type. It doesn't have to be like a bourgeois parliament, but it has to be similar to a parliament in the sense of being directly elected. So you have really a two-tier system. Voters at the grassroots level and their representative at the assembly. I think at least the mathematical analysis points in this direction. Another separate question is what system of election would be desirable for such a system. that is a separate question, which I'm not going to go into. I think I've spoken long enough.
Thank you very much, Moshe. Nevertheless, a fascinating contribution. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. Over to you, Mike Macnair.
I'll mute myself. Thank you, Moshe. I unmute. I think I'm unmuted. Am I unmuted?
No, no.
Okay. I approach this issue from a somewhat different angle. I start with the point in Moshe's pieces, but also in my own. There has to be a transition. We don't leap immediately into full communism. Yeah. I should add that the transition process has actually already begun under capitalist rule, in spite of the fact that the continued existence of capitalist political rule of the capitalist state order means that things which are aspects of the transition to communism can be rolled back. And we've got this going on before our eyes. The National Health Service and the public education system are both movement in the direction of communism. I'm not going to say that welfare benefits are movement in the direction of communism, because welfare benefits were introduced in the form of the Elizabethan Poor Law around 1600 in the earliest days of capitalism, and that was to replace the previous primary role of the Catholic Church in distributing welfare benefits. But these things can be rolled back, and we've got projects to roll back the National Health Service ongoing. It's one of the core demands of the Trump administration in relation to a free trade agreement with Britain. In the Trump administration itself is also seeking, as far as possible, to roll back public education and give education over into the hands of the churches. So that these things can be rolled back as long as the state exists. But secondly, and there's another aspect of this, to pose the possibility of communist reorganization of society, it's necessary to overcome the managerialism of the organized workers' movement, because the managerial class in the organized workers' movement, extending from the tops of the AFL-CIA on the right to the full-time officials of the Socialist Workers' Party on the left, give practical support to capitalism. And because as long as we offer managerialist forms of organization, it creates inherently splintering of the far left, and it makes us look unserious to the general public. Secondly, we need to construct as it was said of the German SPD before the First World War, and as was said of the Italian Communist Party before it collapsed into Eurocommunism, a state within a state, which backs up and supports trade union organization, which backs up and supports workers' education efforts, which backs up and supports cooperatives. And in order to do that, it's necessary to delegitimize, to undermine the political authority of the judicial power of the capitalist media, of the current corrupt electoral system. And to do that, just as we need to fight for democracy in the workers' movement, we also need to fight for political democracy in the state as it exists. Secondly, we're concerned with principles, not exact details. And Moshe's mathematics may look like it's addressing exact details, but it's actually addressing principles and the way in which principles don't work properly under the scheme of councils which elect superior councils, Mm. Our aim is a regime of self-government. That's going to involve a principle of subsidiarity. I know it's an EU law concept that decisions should be taken at the most local possible level. Yeah. We are not going to hold a worldwide referendum to decide whether a bicycle factory in northern England or southern India should have the ability to spend money on experimenting with a new form of bicycle. Yeah. Subsidiarity, I think it's important to add, has to be a constitutional convention. I know this is an English constitutional law concept. Constitutional conventions are customs of the Constitution, which are not as such legal rules, and the sanction for which is political obloquy. It has to be constitutional convention rather than legal federalism of the sorts you have in the United States or in Switzerland. The reason why is because if you have legal federalism, the decision is ultimately has to be the court, a judicial body. That vests the ultimate legal federalism vests sovereignty in a judicial body. And that's why the capitalist class loves federalism, because the judicial power is the one of the critical elements of the capitalist political regime. Subsidiarity, then, a constitutional convention of subsidiarity, not a juridical rule. Secondly, again, decision procedures involve inevitably delegation. I made the point in the second of my articles against Paul Cockshott. If we say that there's referendums with the unrestricted right of initiative, the consequence is going to be that I wake up in the morning and I open my inbox and I find 20 million referendum proposals waiting to be dealt with. That's the same. It's not quite the same as Moshe's point that it requires too much activism at grassroots level, because the 20 million referendum proposals to be dealt with is just physically impossible to make decisions. So it's not a question of the people will be demoralized, though they would be demoralized by that level of expectation of decision, spending all your time on decision making. But it just wouldn't physically impossible. And then the consequence is there is necessary delegation. It is unavoidable. It's not just a question of elected representative delegation. If we have a referendum, we delegate the decision process to the guys who draw the question. And we've seen, in fact, what that means in David Cameron's 3 fraudulent referendums on the alternative vote, on quote proportional representation, meaning the alternative vote procedure, on Scottish independence, and then on Brexit. It's of course we knew historically we knew it was a referendum which gave Hitler all power when he actually only had a largest minority in the Reichstag. It was a referendum which transferred all the powers of the French people to the Emperor Napoleon, first as first consul and subsequently as emperor. It was referendums which transferred all the powers of the parliament to Louis Bonaparte. It was a referendum which created the current constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So we have to delegate decision procedures, and actually delegating decision procedures to whoever the hell draws the question which is set in a referendum is a very bad way of doing it. We have to delegate to representatives, but we also have to delegate to the localities, to sectoral bodies, like whoever the hell is running the railways, to, in some cases, to individuals. I've made the point elsewhere. I once, in my experience, in my youth, I was on picket line and there was no chief steward, and the consequence, there was disorganized Barney with the fascists who attacked the picket line and with the cops, which should have been either dealt with by methods of organized methods of forcible self-defense, or by withdrawing because we weren't in a position to actually fight these guys. But in the absence of a chief steward, it winds up with a whole load of people getting arrested without actually succeeding in defending the picket line. So sometimes we need individual decision making. We have to recognize also private property is a decision rule. The regime of private property is a regime by which the society as a whole delegates to the private property owner decision about how that property is used. Now, we can turn that on its head if we have a regime in which the decisions are permanently delegated to X, who is the General Secretary. That's a private property regime. We've created private property. It's not juridically private property, but it's still private property. So these are general principles which I'm talking about. Third point. I and other comrades in CPGB, we stand for workers' control. We stand for workers' self-management in the factories, in the schools, in the etc., etc., etc. We stand for local government. We stand for trial by jury, for the defense of trial by jury and the extension of trial by jury. But we don't stand for the idea that workers' councils can be the central decision authority. I approach this from a very different approach. I agree with the reasons that Moshe gives, that the consequence of having I think it's probably, I think from personal experience, that it's probably actually impractical without already having delegation from it to have a decision-making body of more than about 50 or 60. I've spent my last not the current, but I spent 20 years of my life as a fellow of an Oxford college, which is a self-governing cooperative of academics, although it's theoretically a charity. When the governing body gets up towards 80 or 90, it's unmanageable size for a committee to actually take decisions. So you are going to be involved in this hierarchy and vote dilution and so on. Secondly, I've also made the point in revolutionary strategy. The working class as a class is not only the guys who are in work. It's not only the guys who are in workplaces which are big enough to have a works council, because, for example, okay, suppose we impose workers' self-management on a coffee joint round the corner, Costa Coffee up the road from here. A combined committee of the whole of all the Costa franchisees in England might be able to take reasoned, rational decisions, but the guys who work on shifts in Costa up in Cowley, there's only half a dozen of them. That's too small to be a functional workers' councils. And so the reality is that the working class as a class consists not only of the people in work in large workplaces, but also the people in work in small workplaces, and the people who are out of work because they're between jobs, and the pensioners who are actually dependent on not on high quality privately invested pensions, but on the state pension. And the children, etc. So the working class is not just. It's a misconception to think that a factory-based franchise will give you a representation of the working class as a class. Secondly, the theory of workers' councils, etc., as being this is a spontaneous development of the masses, which automatically occurs in every revolutionary crisis, is just not true. The Russian Soviets in 1905 were set up by the Mensheviks on the basis of a conference resolution of the Mensheviks, which advocated the creation of trades and labour councils on the then extant English model. These were then seized on and made into organs of struggle in Petrograd and Moscow, but not much wider. They were then revived by the Mensheviks and the Right SRs in February 1917 as a means of war mobilization in the interests of the Russian war effort. And then, of course, however, they let them, they allowed them to function democratically sufficiently that the Bolsheviks were able to take over, whereas in contrast, the German majority SPD insisted that when there were workers' councils in Germany in 1919, they had to include the army officers. The army was the soldiers, Soviets, were represented by the army officers. And they had to exclude the political parties, which meant it didn't exclude the majority SPD, but who were present in the trade unions, but it excluded the USPD and the communists. Trotsky made this point in Lessons of October in 1923, and he made it again in comments on the Spanish Revolution in 1931, that it's an illusion to suppose that there will automatically, that just calling for Soviets will result in solving the problem. It doesn't. It doesn't solve the problem, even doesn't solve the problem of the mobilization. Thirdly, the hierarchy of Soviets, the Russian system essentially, as created in 1918, the Soviets are ordinary local government bodies. The urban Soviet, so there is a Petrograd Soviet. There is a Moscow Soviet and so on. The rural Soviets, on the other hand, there's a village Soviet which delegates to an Oblast Soviet, which delegates to a province Soviet. And then these guys, the province Soviet delegates to the Congress of Soviets. And then the Congress of Soviets delegates power to the Executive Committee of the Congress of Soviets. And then the Executive Committee of the Congress of Soviets appoints Sovnarkom, the Council of People's Commissars. But the Council of the Executive Committee of Soviets only meets every 3 months. The Congress of Soviets only meets once a year. That gives you as much control over Sovnarkom as the Congress of the SWP has over the Central Committee of the SWP, which is to say none. The reason for this is because they've thought of the Soviet structure as not a parliament, but as an organization of the working class, which is put into power. They've used the forms of the working class, which inevitably the working class parties and trade unions have to say there's a Congress which meets once a year, which elects an executive which meets quarterly or at most monthly, which elects because simply we haven't got the time. Capitalists don't give us the time. A ruling working class needs to create a elected body which meets daily as a parliament does. Because otherwise it's not going to exercise practical control, can't possibly either deal with all the business or exercise practical control over the government. So that was my third point, that in relation to the Soviet structure. My fourth point is some differences with Moshe's paper. In the first place, Moshe's paper is structural, and he says and deliberately puts on one side the questions of freedom of speech, transparency of decision making, and related questions. Actually, I think those are ones which we can't put on one side, because it's even whatever structure we adopt, without those general principles of freedom of speech, transparency of decision making, reporting back, and so on and so forth, we can't possibly actually have political democracy. Related to this is the question of the political representation of the petty bourgeoisie. I raised this because Paul Cockshott proposed we should give over everything immediately to juries, sortition, general sortition. And I think that in communist society, fully developed communist society, it is going to be, Moshe proposes this in his paper, sortition using a panel of candidates and votes for a parliament, or sortition just pull a constituent out of a hat and conscript them to serve as an MP. Yeah. For a communist society, I think that's entirely correct. Yeah. That sort of method. Having said that, for the transition period, there is a substantial surviving petty bourgeoisie. And one of the lessons of the Soviet experience is that if you attempt to suppress the political representation of the petty bourgeoisie, which is what they did with the ban on factions and the ban on opposition parties in 1921, you don't actually suppress the electoral political representation of the petty bourgeoisie. You just make the political representation of the petty bourgeoisie take the form of secret Renaissance court style factional maneuverings within the central apparatus of the party and of the government, and so on and so forth. So that the principle of transparency is a reason for having elections rather than sortition in the first phase, at least, of this transition. Secondly, and this is a me thing, I think whatever scheme we adopt has to be fairly rough and ready. The English Constitution before the 1850s had a lot of participatory, as it were, democratic elements in it, but democratic elements for property owners only. Because the franchise was restricted to property owners, it could be quite highly participatory. Going along with that is a principle of English law, which I've got in front of me from the Lord Chancellor Bromley inducting the new Chief Justice of the Common Pleas in 1582. It's a principle that judges must not introduce a general inconvenience in order to avoid a private mischief. This strange expression means that what is being on offer is a rough and ready legal system which delivers approximate justice 90% of the time. Whereas if you try and deliver 100% justice, actually you wind up not delivering. You deliver what the Master of the Rolls in 1990s called a Rolls-Royce judicial system, in principle, highly brilliant system, but it's only available to the very rich who can afford to pay. And that goes equally for electoral systems and general structures of constitutional order and so on and so forth. You need to have something which is approximate, rough and ready, workable. Conversely, I'm less worried than Moshe is about people being demoralized and refusing to participate, precisely again for this looking back on the English Constitution before 1850. It seems to me that why we get, one of the things we get after 1688, in fact, is a sudden rise in the number of people who try and find dodges to get out from under serving as police constable, which was you were conscripted to be one of the parish constables. By Buggin's turn, it would be your turn to be constable this year. You start getting people desperately trying to get out of that, desperately trying to get out of jury service and so on, desperately trying to find excuses not to do militia service. But the reason why they're doing that is because the incentive structure of capitalism pushes people to work more hours in the day, to focus on their own business, to focus on their own job, and to not participate to the extent, whereas in feudalism, the extent to which there's that pressure to avoid public service is much less. And I think in communism, the extent to which there is pressure to avoid public service, it will also be much less, partly because we're driving down working hours, work sharing with no loss of pay and all of that sort of stuff. And in that circumstance, I think we can live with a good deal more conscription for different forms of public service, which then makes participation in less of it's. I don't think it's a total. I'm not saying that's a complete answer, but I think it's rather less of a problem than it at first sight appears to be. But I agree fundamentally. The formula of council communism, it's sort of attractive in theory, and it reflects the fact that we do want to see self-management of all the different bits of the society, but it doesn't solve the problem of central political authority, central political decision making, and for that we need directly elected full-time what do we call it? The England wound up calling it Parliament, but a General Assembly or Congress or whatever the hell you want to call it. That's it.
Thank you very much, Mike, and beautifully timed as well, if I don't mind you saying. Right, comrades, it's open to the floor. If you click the raise hand button on your screen, we can bring you in as a panelist. As there are no hands immediately up, I'll ask a little question. The other great attraction of council communism was that it's something that really grew out of some of the disasters of the Russian Revolution. I mean, the fact that the German SPD played such a leading role in crushing the German Revolution, the fact that the Bolsheviks crushed the uprising at Kronstadt, and so on, and the suppression of workers' opposition and the virtual impotence of the Soviets by that time anyway. It seems to have arisen as much as anything else as a way of how do we stop the dictatorship of the proletariat becoming, in fact, the dictatorship of the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the party. In the meantime, Anne has joined the fray. So, Anne, over to you.
Hi. So, right. Okay. So that was very interesting. However, I have a couple of problems, particularly with what Mike is saying. I mean, in terms of Soviets, or I would call them like committees, excuse me, local, in particular, local committees, not being the way that the working class organizes. I don't see that. I mean, in my experience, in my whatever 40 odd years experience, I've been involved both in Britain and Ireland. Every time there's an issue, whatever, be it economic or political, local committees spring into being, and invariably national organizations which bring together those representatives of those committees are on a delegate basis. So like, I'm wondering, are you arguing against that as a form of organization? Because my understanding has always been is that the manner in which the organization of the working class comes about reflects something real, reflects something about the democratic impulses of the working class to come together locally, regionally, nationally on a delegate basis. Now, I take what's been said about the democratic problems in a post-revolution world, but I think that this is a real phenomenon. So when you say, Mike, that Soviets aren't necessarily a phenomenon, that they came into being, they were first created by the Mensheviks, etc., but well, yes, that's true, but they became something real. They became something real for the working class in Russia, because something can be invented by a political party, but it will never take root because the working class don't view it as something useful for itself. But they did see it as something useful, and I mean, again, I can see the problems with the decision making with the Soviets because of the layers and different vested interests along the way. The only thing, though, I would say is that in respect of workers' councils being set up, in communities, around a particular issue, there is always Parliament overhead, if you like, and there's always something else happening. There's always the elections, and they don't usually relate to the elections, and which is something I think is a very serious problem, in that elections aren't being used. But I do see them as something that are real, and although I think that it's very important to consider what's the best idea democratically, I don't think that we can't kind of invent something new, on our own. We have to consider what's already thrown up by the working class struggle. So, and just one very final point is that, having read a little bit of E.H. Carr on the factory councils in the Soviet Union, I would see a lot of problems with them, in that I think that they became very narrow. So if there's workers' self-organizations in factories under socialism, they themselves would tend to be concerned with their product, with their rights in that factory. And I would have thought that it would be better to have community or district committees rather than factory committees. Anyway, that's all. Thank you.
Do you want to take a few questions? If so, then Brian Green, please. Brian, you need to unmute yourself, comrade.
Hi, it's not a question, it's a contribution. Is that okay?
Sure, of course.
I'm on my phone, so I won't put on my video. Are we Democrats? Are we jurists? Or are we emancipated, collaborative producers? Because if we're the latter, then we have to think in a new way, and you can't simply extrapolate from capitalism. So, thinking as emancipated producers, how do we organize production? How do we organize the output of production? Now, returning to the Gotha program, critique of the Gotha program, Marx talks about the common fund, which everybody misunderstands. So the common fund expresses the collective will of society. It is production for need, the need to transform society, the need to elevate skills, the need to overcome the catastrophe that is our planet, the need to equalize and get rid of the unevenness between nations. That is where production for need takes place. And obviously, because it expresses the collective will of society, it has to involve the whole of society. So the internet, you're looking at structures. The whole discussion we've had this evening is just extrapolating structures from capitalism. But we have television, we have the internet, we have social media. We would be discussing at a society-wide level, not to discuss the details and the intricacies, but to set the budgets based on priorities. It most probably would be a discussion that would take a year, 2 years to set a 3 or 4 year plan. But that is where the collective will. But there's also individual choice. And that individual choice is what I call consumer-led planning. So workers give of their labor and are rewarded by the products of their choice. Nothing is allowed to stand in between that. That is the experience and the lessons from the Soviet Union. So the roles are reversed. In the Soviet Union, it was the planners who decided what would be produced, and the rest of society had to put up with that. Now the active element is the consumers, the passive element is the planners. They collate and aggregate all the decisions and orders that have been given to them by the workers who are now the united worker producer. They know what the income is, they know what things cost to produce. They tell the planners what needs to be produced, and the planners organize production accordingly. We spoke about that bicycle and whatever. It's not individual plants who make these decisions. They can't. I mean, if individual plants decided what to produce, like the anarchists would like them to do, we'd have the market back in 10 years because it'd be overproduction, underproduction, misdirection, misproduction, and so on and so forth. The final point I want to make, for example, is you all talk about the importance of politics and of representation and so on and so forth. Let me give you just one example. As a producer, we talk about collective ownership, but collective ownership is only a slogan, because the problem with that is that what we inherit, the means of production, is uneven. So some workers are more productive than other workers. You can have all the democracy in the world, but that's not going to solve the problem. What is going to solve the problem is, as a producer, you recognize that you have to weight the average labor time to take into account different productivities so that the price reflects this weighting. This isn't a democratic thing. This is a production thing. And people need to break from thinking of democracy as a purely structural phenomenon. It's about equal rights that flow from production themselves. It's not equal rights that are based on representation. All the councils in the world could make decisions on what the price of something should be, but there is an objective factor, and that is the weighted average labor time. So I think people need to reorientate a bit how they think about the future society to make it attractive enough to win workers to it. That's me done.
Great, thank you very much. There's been quite a few points made, so I've got Abraham and in the waiting list, as it were. So, but perhaps those points so far, is that I don't want anyone to be lost, as it were. Do you want to come back first, Mike?
Yeah, I have a quick go. Ian Kronstadt, this is the standard thing. For what it's worth, I think Trotsky was correct that there were British warships hanging around of Kronstadt, and if the Soviets had not suppressed the Kronstadt uprising, the fortress would have been taken by the British Navy within 2 or 3 months. And you would remember the Russian Revolution as a revolution which, as a short-lived and useless attempt of the Bolsheviks to make a revolution. And the Paris Commune is the GLC.
Sorry.
The Paris, and put in the chat the Paris Commune. What about the Paris Commune? The Paris Commune was the French equivalent of the Greater London Authority, which the working class took over in the course of defending the city against the German siege, but then turned into something which was much more radical and more significant. Alan Gibson from the chat, what is meant by a state within a state? It's the whole, a party which also builds up its own militia, which also builds up its own network of public newspapers, which also builds up its own its cooperatives, its affiliate related trade unions, etc., 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 but which is rejects proposes a radical alternative to the constitutional order. And yes, it's true, the Mensheviks set these things up, but they became real. But Trotsky's point, which I think is absolutely clear in 1923 and in 1931, they are real, but they're real because the whole of the workers' movement comes in on them. And they're real because the whole of the workers' movement comes in on them, because the right wing of the workers' movement is prepared to introduce them and set them up. And so Trotsky's point is, we have to somehow find the means for the communists to engage with the right wing of the workers' movement. In Russia, that was done by the Soviets, but the right wing of the workers' movement is not going to make that mistake again. And that's pretty fucking clear, actually. And yes, all sorts of ad hoc committees and so on, and delegate bodies and so on and so forth, yes, are created in the trade in the trade union struggle as well. But the question is, can they pose central political authority for the purpose of taking planning decisions which will enable the factories to keep running and so on. Brian, I don't think social media and the internet make the least difference at all. Social media is, and in particular, but is basically advertising funded, controlled by the capitalist class, controlled by the capitalist state. And in fact, we've seen instances where the capitalists have been caught out by social media operations, as in Iran in the early days of the Women Life Freedom movement. But as soon as the state is aware that this is going on, it can just shut the stuff down. So the internet and social media are much more vulnerable to capitalist control than old-fashioned print newspapers. Okay, we wouldn't get away with old-fashioned print newspapers now, but we could if we were under circumstances where we were going to be shut down immediately. The left could organise to smuggle newspapers in across borders and so on and so forth. So I think that the thinking of the internet as a problem, as social media set up as a solution to these things is delusional. Overproduction. Marx, I think, makes the point in relation to housing that a socialist society would have to run continuous relative overproduction. And it's not terribly surprising that it would have to run continuous relative overproduction, because the capitalist economy runs on continuous relative overproduction. It's just that the capitalist economy overproduces useless things, which are then dumped in landfill on on a very large scale. But you can't have perfect. You can no more have perfect efficiency in the economy than you can have engines with zero tolerances and no lubrication. So I think that's all the issues which were raised, which I'm responding to. That's it.
Thank you. Moshe.
Yeah, just a couple of remarks. First of all, I agree with almost everything that Mike said, including a less, let us say, rosy view of councils in general, let alone as a mechanism of decision making, the pyramidal structure of councils, but as a valid form of organization for revolutionary struggle, I stand corrected by his greater historical knowledge. I think I was too optimistic. By the way, let me point out that the essay that I've circulated was written in 2009, quite a long time ago. I think people tend to underestimate, that's the next point, underestimate the number of central decision-making decisions that have to be made almost continually. It is not simply good enough if you look at the details of so-called economic planning, and I think the very distinction between economy and politics is an artifact of capitalism, by the way. But central decision making on planning, it is simply not good enough to set, let us say, a plan once in a year or 2 years, and then maybe make fine-tuning. It has to be constantly readjusted in view of feedback from the, as it were, from the cold face. There are any number of unexpected occurrences that can throw the operation of the economic planning out of kilter, and the decisions have to be made constantly. I think compared to the number of votes that a bourgeois parliament has to make per year, the number of decisions that would have to be taken centrally at a national level, let alone international level, is far, far greater. And so it is simply impossible to delegate it to a pyramid of councils, let alone to a referendum based decision making. I think the point is similar. The grassroots decision maker would be inundated by the number of decisions to be voted on, to the extent it would be impossible. Finally, as the question of sortition may be in a fully communist society, sortition applied to the general population would be feasible. I think at least in a transitional stage, it is probably more likely to work on a sort of compromise level, sortition among volunteers, not sortition that this is the voting, the representation system that I propose in this in this essay. That is to say, sortition, lottery, not among the general population, as, for example, today for the jury system, but among volunteers. And the difference is that a jury service is a service for a limited length of time. It is not something that one has to do for at least a whole year. In order to avoid people conscripted to do something that they find either boring or incomprehensible for in the transitional stage, it is in my view a much more realistic option to do a compromise solution of sortition among volunteers, people who actually volunteer for this service. But anyway, this is a point that we can leave safely for the future to decide on.
Thank you, Moshe. Abraham.
Yes, thank you. I'm very interested in the discussion because it seems to be taking place in the context of what hopefully one considers to be a pre-revolutionary situation. In the world, at large, we're encountering openings which had not previously existed for us to consider. So I would congratulate this forum on doing so. It seems that the discussion is how to decide in terms of a country, a society. And I think it's gone so far as to go beyond that very question to decide how one decides. That is, what is the mechanism of deciding how to decide? Because that is the open question. Okay. Now, what the mechanism has been engaged in previously to do so in various other revolutionary situations is like a constituent assembly, which are usually encompassed, by only the elite of the time. And even in the Canadian situation where I am, written by one guy, calling himself Trudeau. Okay. So there has to be some sort of, mechanism which corresponds to the ideals that we have established, in economic terms. And we have to develop, as Moshe refers to, the political economy of revolution. And I think that this is in terms of, political philosophy, which I've been forced to study, we can conceive of the difference between civil society and the state. Now, the state we know is a bourgeois creation, created at the time of the bourgeois development for the sake of its own purposes, and functions in that manner, according to the, corporate model, which we want to avoid, of course. So what we have to counterpose to the state is civil society, except that it's not organized and it's not independent in counterposition to the state. So I think that if we have a model, imagine a paradigm of a constitutional assembly that represents an independent civil society with proportional representation for all the minorities, which otherwise are subject to the dictatorship of the majority, including all the various castes and sectors of the society, according to gender, etc., then we can have something which is organic and dynamic and revolutionary. And I would offer that as a suggestion. It's not been written up. I haven't, established anything extensive on that matter, but I have sort of, considered it in the context of Palestine, where a federation of nations, seems to be the appropriate model. Thanking you for your consideration.
Thank you very much, and also enjoyed your optimism there. Anne, over to you. You'll need to unmute yourself, comrade.
Hello, hello, hello.
Good.
Okay, sorry about that.
Very good.
Technology. Okay, a few points. First of all, I think Moshe, is that his name? Moshe? Sorry if I'm butchering your name, Moshe. He kicked off with this thing about council communism, and I think immediately that was sort of like an attempt to smear the idea of, the Soviet power or workers' councils or proletarian democracy. Obviously this idea of proletarian democracy, in my mind, it's You know, it's the essence of Marxism. First of all, you know, I would like to say that I'm not totally familiar with the, you know, your you know, the theory of the people who are speaking. So, you know, this is all a learning curve for me. But I have been reading quite a few articles, and you know, one of the points that seems to come across is that we get this idea of, you know, the you know, speaking in glowing terms about the, you know, the democratic republic. But I think, you know, that terminology to me seems to be, you know, very ambiguous. You know, what do we mean by, you know, democratic republic? You know, are we talking about, you know, are we talking about something more or less, you know, like we've got now without a monarchy? You know, so if you know, conceivably we get rid of the monarchy, we've got some sort of a, you know, democratic republic. And in my mind, you know, that would remain like every capitalist regime. It would remain a ruling class dictatorship. So, you know, every capitalist regime is a ruling class dictatorship. So I think that, you know, what we need to establish is that our idea of a democratic republic is not a bourgeois democratic republic, but it's a proletarian democracy. You know, and even though, you know, that terminology to me, you know, it's quite clumsy, but I suppose it's the best we've got. So we're looking at proletarian democracy, and you know, I think that, you know, the plank of Marxism, you know, the sort of like the fundamental of Marxism as regards the you know, the bourgeois state in any variant of the bourgeois state is it's a capitalist dictatorship, and the proletariat must smash it. You know, so, you know, so to me, you know, if you reject you know, the smashing of the bourgeois state, if you think that the, you know, the proletariat can come to power under the, you know, some sort of arrangement within the current state form, then I don't think that you're a Marxist. You know, I think a Marxist you know, stands on the platform of smashing the bourgeois state, and you know, we want, you know, our alternative, you know, is the creation of a proletarian democracy. Now, you know, I think Mike sort of like, you know, dismissed the Paris Commune as a GLC. You know, okay, you know, I think Marx was a little bit more positive about it, wasn't he? Yeah, but you know, essentially the basis of socialism, in, you know, every aspect of socialism, you know, the foundation is capitalism. Capitalism provides the you know, the foundation of socialism. Without capitalism, there's no socialism. You know, we can't go from sort of like some sort of a primitive pre-capitalist society to socialism or communism. So, you know, it's all built on what capitalism provides. So, you know, yeah, obviously, you know, the communes in Paris were there before. They were pre-existing. But you know, what was the why did Marx see the Paris Commune as being the, you know, the dictatorship of the proletariat? You know, he didn't say, oh, this is just another, you know, another emanation of the ruling class dictatorship. You know, this is a, you know, this is it. This is, you know, for all its flaws, you know, and it's, you know, he characterized it as the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think that, you know, the things that he was looking at, you know, the essential features of it, which we cannot do without, you know, all officials elected and subject to recall, immediate recall. Therefore, there must be some sort of like permanent political activity at the base in order to recall delegates. And I think also another plank of this was, you know, cheap government. So all delegates paid an average working man's wage, or a working person's wage, we might be better saying today. And as I understand it, you know, the Paris Commune, you know, if we take that as being some sort of indication, you know, it's not perfect. I see that, yeah, you know, but some sort of indication of how the dictatorship of the proletariat might function. You know, it wasn't a case of sort of like, councils of 50 creating, hundreds, sorry, I'm exaggerating, 5 or 6 levels, before we got to some sort of a central council with authority. As I understand it, the voters or the people who were elected delegates directly elected delegates to the city level. So that was one level. And I'm just imagining, from there, if we got some sort of alternate history whereby it actually extended beyond Paris, from there there'll be another level to national. I'm counting 2. I'm not sure where this sort of like these councils of 50 people creating 6 or 7 levels, whereby the individual participation or input is completely lost. I'm not sure where that's coming from, But I would also say that in the future, there will probably be more than the national level. We will get an international Soviet or council, yes, the World Council. But I'm still wanting to know, what the alternative is to this proletarian democracy. What the alternative is to what Lenin wrote in State and Revolution. Because all I can see is that either it's something which is dependent on the constant political input of the working class at the base, without which you can't really get instant recall, or it's some other method whereby there is some sort of representation and the working class is basically out of the picture. I would like to say, at the end of the day, that this proletarian democracy is not going to come about in normal circumstance. I think that if you're thinking that you're going to get into coalition with some sort of a Labour Party or Social Democratic Party, and that is going to be the means by which we create this this democratic republic based on direct election of recallable delegates, I think you're highly mistaken. I think it's only going to come out of a revolutionary situation. Okay, I think I'll stay there. I'll stick at that. Oh, sorry. I would say that just my final sort of like parting shot is that we don't seek to replicate anything that's gone in the past. So we can see the Paris Commune and the 1905 Soviets and the 1917 Soviets is sort of like indicating some sort of path towards proletarian democracy, but it's still in nappies, and the future will create what it creates. We can't say exactly what these proletarian bodies will be in advance. Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Anne. Anne wanted to come back in briefly, and then we'll go to Moshe, if that's okay. Anne, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not going to respond to Anne's except to say that I think that there can be a very great problem with attachment to previous forms as though they were, the answer forever. And that is the case with Soviets as well as any other form. I know I did say earlier that I think that the working class spontaneously creates local committees and similar like representative delegate-based bodies, and I would stick to that. But also I accept that there was a very serious problem between the local and the national in the Soviet Union, and that I accept Moshe's calculations and theory also. So, but I think that there still is an issue between local and national or international. There still is a question that isn't resolved simply by saying that there should be a more kind of parliamentary form of organization. Anyway, but what I wanted to ask was, do you think that the development of bureaucracy in the Soviet Union was facilitated by the Soviet system, insofar as being so far removed from the local Soviets created a situation where vested interests could more easily develop? Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. Moshe, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I leave Anne's last question to Mike to answer. I'm not sure whether it is the Soviet system that actually facilitated the generation of the Russian Revolution. In fact, I don't think it was even ever tried, because there is no experience of the pyramid of councils ever to have been used as a decision-making framework. We have no experience, and I think it is simply not fit for purpose. And with due respect to Anne, you cannot come with a preconceived idea without looking at what it entails. I made very simple points which are interconnected, that a pyramidal structure of councils entails a dilution of the power of the decision-making power of the individual voter at the grassroots. That is to say, if you have as a multi-tier system with 3, 4, or 5 levels, and I don't stick, I gave the number of 100 members of a council as simply as an example, but in any kind of pyramid with several levels, the more levels you have, the individual voter at the grassroots has less decisional influence over the outcome. It is diluted, and at every level, you lose about 20% of the voting power at the grassroots. And the second point is that if you have a multi-level pyramid of councils, then the phenomenon of discrepancy between the outcome at the top and the views at the grassroots is the likelihood of it and the size of it is likely to increase. That is to say that the decision made at the top level of the pyramid is going to be supported by, not by the majority, but by a minority of the members of the society. This is inherent in a pyramid, in a multi-level decision-making apparatus, and the more levels there are, and the number of levels will have to increase with the size of the society. That is to say, whether it is regional or national or international, you need more levels. And the worse these two phenomena become, and these are objective facts that you cannot escape from by simply quoting that this is the form of proletarian decision making. This is what the proletarian decision making has to be, a pyramid of councils. It doesn't, and it cannot be. It will not work.
Thank you, Moshe. Mike.
Okay. Alan Gibson. Yes, the SPD and the labour movement before, workers' movement before 1914 did train the working class for the possibility of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And we can see that from the fact that the result that it was guys who were trained in that pre-1914 socialist movement who became the cadre of the Communist International, the communist parties, who proposed and set up Soviet forms of workers' councils, etc., etc., etc. In Germany, Austria, though they didn't actually they wound up not succeeding in overthrowing the bureaucracy, and in consequence not overthrowing, because they weren't. In essence, they needed to lynch the full-time officials of the trade unions and the top elected representatives of the SPD, and if they didn't do that, they weren't going to take power away from the capitalists. Abraham, state and civil society, my understanding, for what it's worth, is that state is a renaming in the late Middle Ages in the Italian city-states of what was previously called res publica or politea. So that the idea of the res publica or politea, the political society separated from the society more generally, is from antiquity. It becomes, we start using the language of state because the Italians, the guys who were the equivalent of Stalinism in the late medieval Italian city-states, the condottieri who seized power as military dictators and started calling themselves dukes and things like that, didn't like the word republic because it sort of carried with it the idea of republicanism. And so they started calling their regime lo Stato. And then Thomas Hobbes and others around Thomas Hobbes brought it into English as a way of talking about the Constitution, which didn't carry with it overtones of republicanism. Civil society, on the other hand, in Hegel, is bürgerliche Gesellschaft. And too often, and it's also actually in Marx often meaning bourgeois society. In Hegel, it means urban society. In the philosophy of right, it means urban society. But the problem with setting up civil society as the alternative to capital is that it leaves out the conflict of interest which exists between the woman who wrote Lean In on the one hand and the serfs who work in the Chinese factories manufacturing manufacturing hardware on which Facebook runs. And equally the conflicts of interest among that. And democratic republic, well, I don't know about Moshe, but we CPGB guys, we've written about this at considerable length. It's the arguments which I've actually fairly recently reviewed Bruno Leipold's book on Marx as a Republican. What happened essentially is that the success of the election managers in the United States democratic Jacksonian democracy led the capitalist class to appropriate democratic for plutocratic forms of government as long as they had token universal suffrage with periodic elections. That's not what we mean by democratic republic. My point about the Paris Commune is that it starts with the working class taking over the local government organization of the Napoleonic, the Bonapartist state. They take over that and they turn it into something completely different. And I agree, absolutely. Marx says it's this is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx says this involves Zerbrechen smashing into pieces the capitalist state. And I have to say, in my opinion, that's just as much true of the bourgeois revolution, that the bourgeois revolution has to smash into pieces the 1688 in this country, the revolutionaries invite the Dutch army to invade England, and they smash into pieces the English monarchical regime, and they burn down Catholic chapels, and they the supporters of the opposition desert James's army and break his army up into pieces. And then it gives rise to a generalized European war, yeah. And which, in the end of the day, is won by the Dutch and the English. So take the levels, the stuff. It's the levels, multi levels pattern. It is actually in the 1918 Constitution of the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. Mm-hmm. It's in primarily the rural areas, but it's not absent because you've got factory committees which elect to the Petrograd Soviet and stuff like that. But in relation to the peasantry, there is deliberately the creation of multi-tiers levels of Soviet committees. I think actually probably deliberately with the intention of diluting the voting power of the peasantry, who were, after all, 80% of the population of Russia, that the Russian CP was trying to rule over. What if, and you raised the question, what if it wasn't just the Commune, but all France? Mm-hmm. And so at once, it's not enough just to have a Paris institution. What are we going to do with all the other cities, with all the other départements? Mm-hmm. What about decisions? There are some decisions which are all France decisions. There are some decisions which are decisions affecting the coast, which don't affect the inland areas, or which affecting the south, which don't affect the north, and so on and so forth. The same is true, of course, here. Yeah. You're going to wind up with this. Okay, recallability. This is an important point, the right of recall. The advantage of the pyramid structure is that it gives you a very easy and straightforward right of recall, assuming, and this is Moshe's point, is absolutely correct, and Ant has also made this point, it assumes that everybody's mobilized at the base. Because once people get demobilized at the base, then they aren't going to exercise their right of recall. This is absolutely against, Edmund Burke's famously said, we're opposed to MPs having to represent what their members say. But of course, when Edmund Burke said this, I looked it up, and it turned out this was Edmund Burke addressing his electors, trying to persuade them not to sack him. And they did indeed sack him at the next opportunity. So right of recall, there are two lines of argument on this. One of which I think is the better is the Chartists argued for annual elections. I don't think that annual elections is enough to give people acute election war weariness over elections. But it does amount to, if the guy votes against our interests, we can sack him in the pretty near future. The other possibility, which Jack Conrad argues, and I'm sort of uncomfortable with, is to say the party gets to recall its MPs who vote against its line. That's not, it's not a complete innovation, because there are two people in the German SPD who were deselected by the SPD nationally for voting for the military budget. A guy called Gora and a guy called Schippel. And there was a big debate, and this is actually one of the origins of the expression democratic centralism. Do MPs have a mandate from their constituency which entitles them to vote against the party? And the objection to Jack's argument is that the party could be undemocratic, bureaucratically controlled, and that's a real issue. But at the same time, Jack's point, the reverse is, well, if we can't overcome the problem of bureaucracy in the party, then we're never going to overcome the problem of bureaucracy in the trade unions and in the state. You know? So it's a sort of, the first step is to get a party which is democratic enough that it can recall MPs. Anne's question, bureaucracy and the Soviet regime. For what it's worth, my understanding of this is that the Bolsheviks gambled on one of two things happening. One thing was that the German Revolution would come to their aid. Yeah. And that's not so far from what happening. They wouldn't have survived. It hadn't been for the German Revolution in late 1918, early 1919, they wouldn't have survived. Plus, actually, they also got massive strike action against arms supplies to the British intervention in England, and various other external assistance. But at the same time, it didn't give them enough. It didn't give them what they needed, which was massive light industry to be able to trade in any sort of balance with the peasantry. The other alternative line of the gamble was that they thought the German state would act rationally and make a peace with Russia in November, December 1917 in order to free up troops in order to win the war in the West. And what in fact happened was that the Hindenburg-Ludendorff regime in Germany stabbed the German army in the back by refusing to make peace, any sort of acceptable peace with the Russians, and committing large numbers of troops to a new offensive on the Eastern Front, which meant that they couldn't knock the French out of the war before the Americans joined in, and the Germans, they guaranteed that they preferred the defeat of Germany to the victory of the Russian Revolution. Lenin in September 1917 said that can't happen because the German state is bound to act rationally. But no, it didn't. Okay, so then the situation is the German state insists on unacceptable terms at Brest-Litovsk. The Russian Communist Party says our backs to the wall and the guy's pointing a gun at us, the German army is pointing a gun at us. We have to make peace on the Germans' terms. There's no majority for that in the party. There's a majority for it in the Central Committee, which is created by Trotsky's middle group going over to Lenin's group. There's absolutely no majority. The Revolution of October 1917 was a majority revolution because the left SRs had the backing of the very large majority of the peasantry. By making peace with Germany on German terms, they threw the left SRs into opposition, and then they adopted a policy of red terror to control the opposition of the left SRs and rigged the elections to the Soviets in spring-summer 1918. All of that. It wouldn't have been a catastrophe and utterly catastrophic if they'd won the war in Poland or if the German Revolution had won. But then they theorized it, Second Congress of Comintern, Third Congress of Comintern. They come up with this theory that the dictatorship of the proletariat has to be the dictatorship of Workers' Party, and that the Workers' Party is necessarily a minority, so that it's the dictatorship of the advanced part is the dictatorship of the proletariat, and it's the dictatorship of the proletariat over the peasantry, so that they've theoretically, in Second Congress of Comintern, they repudiate the most fundamental distinction between Marx's ideas and those of the guys who were in favor of barrack socialism. Yeah. And that in itself, what they do, they now do what the Chinese Communist Party did, only with the difference that they already control the capital. They send the cadres of the workers' movement out. They make them into the armed striking force to command the peasantry, but by commanding the peasantry to defend the peasantry against the whites who've turned themselves into a sort of Mongol horde. You know? By doing that, the result is that the Bolshevik Party becomes it was a party of about 250,000 as of October 1917, mostly workers. As of 1921, it's still a party of 250,000, but it's 90% state officials. So that they've turned themselves into a collective man on horseback to represent, to be the Louis Bonaparte collective representative master of the peasantry. That's my understanding of where how the bureaucratic degeneration happens. It could have, there's a series of points it could have turned back, but it isn't. At each of those points there isn't a retreat, and it goes further down the road until 1927, 28, when it becomes double left-right coup and you create the police regime, KGB regime, which, well, it's that Cheka regime, which descends into the present FSB regime. But that's just as I say, that's me. We all have everybody has different views on this question. I don't think that I think that the choice of structures makes it more difficult to get back. Doesn't make it impossible to get back, but it makes it more difficult to get back. That's it.
Thank you very much, and thank you, comrades, for a stimulating and excellent evening. I wonder, Moshe, whether you have a kind of final few words to summarize? No? Well, in that case, thank you very much, comrades, and look forward to seeing you all again